Now, if you spent any time actually looking into retirement and how much you actually need in order to retire, you've probably seen huge figures, somewhere between £500,000 and £1,000,000. And that's the figure that's normally quoted. But what if I told you you could actually retire with a lot less money than that? Because the truth is, people massively overestimate how much they need, particularly when they do a lot of research online and see these articles saying you need hundreds of thousands of pounds in order to retire. So in this video, I'm going to show you exactly how much you need to retire and if it's actually possible to retire with as little as £100,000. But if you're new here, my name's Ben, I'm a chartered financial planner, and my aim is to help as many people as possible gain more clarity and confidence around their personal finances and their retirement plan. Okay, so before we actually look at if it's possible to retire with £100,000, we actually need to define how much income you need when it comes to retirement. So on screen now, I've put some figures from the Retirement Living Standards. And this is some research that's been conducted, which shows how much you need for a minimum level of retirement, a moderate level of retirement, and a comfortable level of retirement. So you can see here that for a minimum level of retirement, you need an income of about £13,400. And it's worth noting these are the figures after tax. For a moderate level of income, for a single person, you need about £31,500. And for a comfortable level of retirement, you need about £44,000. Now, you might look at these figures and think, okay, these are actually more than I'm getting as my income now, or very close to it after tax. Now, what I would say to that is I think some of these figures are on the higher side, but as we go through the numbers, I'll be using the minimum and the moderate levels of income when it comes to retirement to give you an idea of how much you actually need and if it's actually possible to retire with as little as £100,000. Okay, what we need to do next is actually look at the options when it comes to retirement, because I think this is an area which a lot of people misunderstand, and quite frankly, it's because it's very confusing. Now, simply put, there are two main ways you can access your pension when it comes to retirement. And those two options are flexible access drawdown or you purchase an annuity. Now, with flexible access drawdown, you effectively use your pension like a bank account. So you can take as much or as little as you want from your pension each year. Now, clearly you run the risk of actually running out of money if you take too much too soon with this approach, but it does give that additional flexibility in terms of how much you draw from your pension. So for example, you may want to take more in the early years of retirement and less in the later years of retirement. So this approach does give you that ability to do that. With an annuity, you effectively go to an annuity provider and say, this is my pension pot, and they will say, okay, thanks, we'll take that money from you, and in return, we will promise to pay you a fixed level of income for the remainder of your life. Now, clearly the benefit of this approach is that you will not run out of money, because that annuity will be payable for the rest of your life, regardless of how long you live. However, the downside to that is the fact that your income is fixed. So, as before, you had the option to take more or less income as you required. With the annuity, that is fixed, so you can't draw more or less if your situation changes. So what I'm going to do now is model out both of these scenarios to show you the impact each can have on whether £100,000 is actually enough for you to retire. So on screen now, you can see the first option, and that is using flexible access drawdown. Now, for the purposes of this video, I've assumed that this individual is retiring at the age of 67, and at which point they've got their full state pension, which, as we stand today, is about £12,500 a year. So if we go back to Retirement Living Standards and the figures they've used, I've used a figure for this example between the minimum and the moderate level of income when it comes to retirement of about £22,500. So you're not scraping a barrel, but equally you're not having that moderate kind of average level of income when it comes to retirement. So on screen now, you can see how your income will actually be made up and where that income comes from. So as I've said, I've assumed you get the full £12,500 state pension, which is payable from age 67. And that leaves a remaining £10,000 to actually be funded from your personal pension. Another thing you'll see on screen is I've assumed that you pay 15% tax on that pension. Now, the reason for that is because, as most people know, you can take 25% of your pension tax-free. However, the thing that a lot of people miss is the fact that you don't have to take that full 25% at one go. So in the example, I've assumed you take a portion of that tax-free cash each year. And then the remaining 75% is taxable at 20%. So again, assuming you're a basic rates taxpayer in retirement. And that gives us the average tax rate of 15%. So you can see here that based on a 5% growth rate within your pension, because again, I've assumed that pension remains invested throughout your retirement, you can see that pension pot runs out around the age of 77. This means therefore that from that age, you are solely reliant on your state pension. Now, you might be looking at this and thinking, okay, well, clearly this is not sustainable because the pension's going to run out. But the thing to remember, and the thing that we see more and more as financial planners, is that people often spend a lot more in the first 10 to 15 years of retirement than they do in the second 10 to 15 years of retirement. And again, you can see on screen, I've assumed in the example, this person lives to the age of 90. So in this example, this could work for you because you might say, okay, well, I want to spend more in the first kind of 10 to 12 years of retirement. But then when I get into my late 70s, early 80s, I'm quite happy just having that state pension because, chances are you're going to have no mortgage, you're going to have very little outgoings. So that £1,000 a month on average from your state pension may be enough to actually support what you need in terms of your expenses. Okay, so let's now move on to the situation where you purchase an annuity. And the big difference with this, as I said before, is the fact that that level of income is fixed. So you're not taking any investment risk and there is no risk that you're going to run out of money. However, the trade-off for that is the fact that the level of income you get is going to be slightly lower. So back in the previous example, we had you having an income from 67 to 77 of about £22,500 a year. However, in this example where you purchase an annuity, instead of that £22,500 a year, that's going to be just over £17,000 a year. But you can see here that because we're purchasing the annuity, that income is guaranteed. So no matter how long you live for, you know that that's going to be paid to you. So you can see again how your income is actually made up. So the majority of it still comes from your state pension and you get a smaller amount from the annuity. So when it comes to actually making the decision around whether you go into drawdown or whether you purchase an annuity, this is one thing to really consider. Because with the drawdown, clearly this gives you a lot more flexibility around how and when you access that pension. But it does come with the downside that you may actually run out of money if you take too much from your pension too soon. Conversely, with the annuity, there is no risk you're taking because that's going to be payable to you for the rest of your life. But clearly the downside to that is that the income you get is going to be slightly lower than if you were using flexible drawdown. So you can see from these two examples that based on you having £100,000 within your pension, it actually might be possible for you to actually retire at 67. Now clearly this is based on one person and having somewhere between a minimum and a moderate level of lifestyle when it comes to retirement. But evidently, if you're in a couple or if you do want a higher level of income when it comes to retirement, that £100,000 is unlikely to be sufficient. Now, one thing that people often overlook and misunderstand is that if you retire earlier, that can have a massive impact on if that £100,000 is actually sustainable. Because clearly in that situation, it means A, in theory, you're working 2 years less because you're retiring 2 years earlier. But B, it also means that that money has actually got to last you, again, in theory, 2 years longer. So how does that actually impact the sustainability of this? And does it actually mean £100,000 is still enough to retire at 65? So again, first example, we're using flexible drawdown. Now the big difference here is that you've got 2 years until your state pension comes in. That means for the first 2 years of retirement, you are fully reliant on your own pension to actually support your income. So you can see on screen that the first 2 years, all of your income is actually coming from your pension. Now clearly this has a massive impact in terms of the sustainability of that pension moving forward. And you can see this illustrated because if you go back to the previous example, we had your money running out around age 77 to 78. Whereas in this example, that's running out about 6 years earlier in your early 70s. Now again, this may not be a problem because as I said before, if you are looking to actually maximize your income in the early years of retirement and you're very happy to accept and are prepared to have a lower level of income in the later years, this could work for you because you still know you've got that guaranteed state pension payable year in, year out, regardless of how long you live for. Okay, now let's look at the annuity example from age 65. And you can see in this example, that income is the same year in, year out from when you retire all the way up to your assumed life expectancy of age 90. Now the big difference here again is because you are retiring 2 years earlier, the annuity rate you get is going to be lower. Now what I mean by annuity rate is this is the percentage of your pension that that annuity provider will pay you. So you would have seen in the previous example at age 67, the annuity rate you would get is about 5.6%. However, in this example, because you are retiring 2 years earlier, instead of that 5.6% annuity rate, is going to be more like 5.3%. And again, this is purely because the annuity provider is looking at this and saying, okay, well, you're retiring 2 years earlier, so the chances are we've got to pay that annuity for about 2 years longer. And as a result, we're going to pay you slightly less each year to account for that. So you can see here that based on a £100,000 pension, that annuity provider is going to pay you about £4,500 a year. And when added to the state pension of £12,500 a year, that's going to give you an income of about £17,000 a year net of tax. So you can see from these examples that retiring with £100,000 could be possible. But there are so many factors at play here. The main one is obviously, as I've discussed, how you take your pension, whether it's through flexible drawdown or an annuity. But there are so many other factors that can have a huge impact. So for example, if you are using flexible access drawdown, are you keeping that money invested or are you moving it to cash? Now, that can have a massive difference over the long term, because if you're keeping it in cash and getting, let's say, a 2% a year return, whereas keeping it invested and probably getting somewhere between a 5 to 7% a year return, again, that can have a huge impact over the long term. And you've also seen how retiring earlier can actually have an impact on your income. And that's the same regardless of if you use flexible drawdown or an annuity. But I think the key takeaway is that it is possible. And, with these figures, we're not scraping the barrel. We're not at that minimum level of income that the retirement living standards have set. We're somewhere between minimum and moderate. But clearly, everyone's own situation is very personal to them. So what I would suggest you do is check out this video here. This discusses how much you need for differing levels of income in retirement, from £2,000 a month all the way through to £5,000 a month. Anyway, hope you've enjoyed the video. Hope you got some value from it, and hopefully I'll see you in the next one.